Welcome to the Supplier Diversity and Inclusion Podcast by Fips Consulting. My name is Andrea Fimian, and I speak with international guests who share their experience on supplier diversity and inclusion, inclusive sourcing, responsible sourcing, sustainable sourcing. Today, I speak to Lukas Hotz. Lukas is the co-founder of Purpose Switzerland. Lukas, thanks so much for being my guest today.
Thank you, Andrea. Super happy to be here with you.
So, Lukas, can you share with us who is Purpose Switzerland?
So Purpose Switzerland is basically the Swiss branch of the International Purpose Organization, and we're trying to make steward ownership more known here in Switzerland and support entrepreneurs when they want to take that route in terms of their ownership structure for their company. So we're doing field building work and we're doing consultancy work in that sense, as well as supporting companies in their financing. So that's pretty much what Purpose Switzerland is.
I think a lot of people probably don't know what steward ownership is. So maybe you can give some more insights on what is steward ownership.
Yes, with pleasure. So to start this, I might take a bit of a step back first and look at what is ownership of a company. And when you look at different contexts in different cultures around the globe, ownership has very different connotations. So in some contexts and cultures, ownership is much more a right and is something that I own it, so I can decide what happens with it. And in other cultures, ownership is much more responsibility. So I own something to take care of it. And that's actually the more ancient view on ownership, how everything started with owning land and so on. And you can still see this today in cultures like the Maori in New Zealand, and even in Switzerland, we have the Almende, which started in the medieval times, where basically you gave land to a group of people to take care of it and to produce basically food for the society, but you wouldn't own it as private people. And so when you look at companies these days, many actually see themselves in the way of owners, but then see that as their responsibility. So when you look at family businesses that have been managed and handed down generation by generation, it's very much a responsibility of these families to make sure this company thrives and continues, and not just like I would own my laptop or my phone. And so steward ownership is basically taking that kind of concept and applies it to a company. So a company is steward-owned when the people who hold the highest power in that company, which is usually the owners by law, when they see themselves as stewards of the company and not just as owners in the sense of this is my tree and I can take as many fruits from it as I want. No, you take as much as you need, was in relation to what you gave to that tree in that example, and the rest is reinvested and stays connected to that tree, basically. And this is not just in the end on a value level, but it's actually implemented in a legal way, so that the rights of the ones who take this owner's role have limits in a steward-owned company. And there is many examples of companies who do that for decades, actually. Well-known ones in Germany, in Europe, like Bosch or Zeiss in Germany, or probably Victorinox or Rolex in Switzerland. Often they have a foundation structure where the foundation owns an operative entity. And so that's how we saw steward ownership for decades already, but we didn't know that it actually existed. And the two main rights of ownership that our law sees today are voting rights and capital rights. So the right to decide what happens in that company is the voting right. It's that the power element, and the right to extract the fruits from a company is the capital rights. In a steward-owned company, these two rights are separated from each other. So unlike a classical share where you have both linked to each other, in a steward-owned company, these two rights are separated from each other, which means you have on the one hand people who take care of the voting rights, the power, and they're the ones holding the steering wheel of that company, but they don't have capital rights. So they don't have the financial incentive privately to lead this ship in a way that maximizes just for profits. But there might be people and organizations that hold capital rights because they maybe gave capital or gave time and effort into the company, and that's then compensated for by holding capital rights in that company. But they, on the other hand, are the ones who can decide or who have the voting power. So that's the key element of steward ownership, is these two rights are separated from each other and implemented so that the one who holds the power cannot just undo it on a mood that they have or on an opportunity to sell. So that's steward ownership in a nutshell.
I think it's very an interesting governance structure in a company, right? And you mentioned some very well-known names like Bosch or Victorinox. So maybe you can share real quick what is the difference to a social enterprise? Because we also know that there are social enterprises out there which can be certified as such. So it's going in that direction, but it's not a social enterprise, right?
Exactly. So steward ownership as such is actually completely neutral in what a company does. So very similar to when you think of a shareholder company, it's just a legal structure, a legal form of ownership. And steward-owned company can do pretty much anything. The key is that whatever you do is always purpose-oriented. But the purpose can be a social purpose, can be an environmental purpose, or other purpose, right? So I think that's the key difference. The two do play together often because for social enterprises and impact businesses and these kind of related business areas, they are often potentially endangered in the long run by financial interests. Or in other terms, they're endangered by the structure and the incentive their ownership structure brings. And so steward ownership liberates these companies from these potential threats on a structural or incentive level for the owners. So I think that's kind of the main difference. Steward ownership completely neutral. Social businesses who have a particular purpose. And also steward ownership, there's no certification for it.
So how do you actually know then that these companies that you mentioned do have such a structure?
We look at their ownership structure, we look at their bylaws, their contracts, their shareholder agreements. So that's why when I mentioned Victorinox, I said probably, and also for Rolex, because we couldn't look in detail into their contracts and structures yet. We would love to do that. So if anyone from Victorinox or Rolex is listening, reach out to us. We would love to talk to you guys. But the fact that they are owned by one or multiple foundations already separates the power element from a private person. And so in that sense, you already to a certain degree have the separation of financial rights and voting rights. That's already a sign that goes into that direction. And then with others, we really look in detail into what their structure is, because there are many, and we just know the main narrative of unicorns, of growth, of these kind of things. And we rarely talk about how a lot of our very successful companies are set up. And our assumption is that their structure is actually one of the reasons why they became so successful.
Very interesting. So just to summarize, steward ownership is really about making sure that you have separation of duty in the company for what you do, but also how you spend your money and what you do with your revenue, and not go higher and higher and more every year.
Exactly. So behind this is basically two core principles are a bit hidden in what I shared before. The first one is the self-determination principle. So that means that steering wheel over the company lies always in the hands of people who are closer related to that company, who have a connection to it. And that means that steering wheel or the control cannot be inherited, and it cannot be sold. Like an example, if I have enough money, I could buy X from Elon Musk, right? And I could turn it around completely again because I now have the control over it. No idea who these employees are, what the technology is, what they exactly do, their responsibility. I don't know, right? So I'm very far away from that business. But if I have enough money, I could buy it and I can control it. And so that's something you want to prohibit in a steward-owned company. And the other principle is we call it the capital lock. So value that is created within a company has been created while pursuing a certain purpose, right? So the value created should be primarily linked to that purpose. and cannot be just extracted. So if you're an investor that gave capital to the company to be able to pursue the purpose, you can extract value from it. And the key question there is that it's somewhere limited, that extraction. And it can be limited either in a certain time period. Let's say you can extract money for 10 years, or it can be limited in an absolute value. So let's say you can extract up to a multiple of your investment, and then you're compensated for the risk that you took. Or, and that's another interesting one, is that you're limited in influence. So let's say you don't have any say at all how much money you get out of it, then this is also somewhat of a cap, because potentially you don't ever get anything. And so these are the three ways of limiting it. And it actually has been proven that those companies pay better salaries, people are more motivated to work there, and so on. And so there are very much economical reasons to do this, and not just social or impact reasons to go that way. And we also know that the kind of these companies exist longer. So they're more resilient in crisis, right? Because they didn't extract that much. So it was all kept in the organization, and that gives them stability over time. For example, that's something we saw with Victorinox, right? During the COVID crisis, they didn't lay off anyone, and they were able to go through that crisis because probably also because of the way they were set up. Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, there's so many reasons why it makes sense to have such an organizational structure. I think that's where you're also very engaged is with startups, right? So they set up their governance structures from the very beginning as such. Once you already have everything set up and maybe investors and contracts in place, it's much harder to change structures than if you do it right at the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that we try to do to make them a bit more aware of that fact, that you put your company on certain rails if you go into a certain part of your structure. And it's not always an easy thing to tell, especially founders, because they're very motivated to get their thing down to the ground and out into the world, and they just need some capital now and don't want to think about what this whole thing is. And that's kind of a danger, right? Where things eventually have to take a certain growth path because you took in certain capital sources. For us, the huge potential, though, that we see is in successions of SMEs. We see a lot of SMEs in Switzerland. I mean, a certain generation is coming to the retirement age now, and they created a lot of companies. And so now they're struggling in finding successors. And often for them, the two main ways of handling your succession is either blood, like you inherit it to your kids, or you sell it. Those two options are often not for these people, because they think of, hey, I actually have a big responsibility for my employees, and I don't just want to sell it to the highest bidder, because I don't just want to sell it to my competitor, because they will probably put my employees on the street and so on. And their kids don't want, or they don't have kids, or they don't want to give it to their kids. I have plenty of reasons why I don't want to keep it in the family as well. And these people are struggling. And then steward ownership can be a different option. I'm not saying it's the better option, but it's another option where you basically sell the company to itself. And so the company buys itself free from the current owner, which also means current owner does get kind of a financial compensation and security for retirement age and time. But then all people can step in and take over control without having the blood and without having the deep pockets to buy those shares. And this opens a new realm of potential successors to take over the reins. And that can be very interesting because it also ensures that a company keeps existing, the legacy goes on, and so on. There's many emotional elements to it as well. So actually, that's where we see a lot of potential for this structure in solving an actual need that we see in our society.
Yeah, totally. And I guess that's not just in Switzerland the case. So you mentioned you are from Purpose Switzerland. So maybe you can tell me, Purpose is like a global organization, and then it has several country organizations, or how is it set up?
Yeah, funny enough, it was actually created in Switzerland about 8-9 years ago. The Purpose Foundation was founded in Basel. There were though mainly German people involved, and so they were then much more active in Germany in the beginning years. The whole organization ecosystem grew a lot in Germany, and it's also much bigger already, a whole movement up to the point where now in the new coalition agreement, it's written that there should be a new legal form for these kind of companies. So it's really at a different state, I would say. And out of this nucleus in Germany, it started to spread globally. And what we see now is in various countries all over the globe, from New Zealand to Japan to Chile to Uganda, there are organizations like ours popping up that want to enable the local ecosystem entrepreneurs to go into such ownership structures. They're all independent all over the world. Some of them use the brand purpose like we do, or some are under their own brands, but we share knowledge and have an exchange amongst each other to help each other bring the whole topic forward. But it's very locally specific how it's implemented and what is the culture, what is the culture of the company, of the people, of so it that has very many different structures as a result, actually. And so it needs that kind of local representation of it. You cannot just take one concept and push it over all the countries.
But great what you see in Germany with an own business structure for steward-owned businesses.
Absolutely, and it would make the implementation easier. That's what we see now in Switzerland. What we often do now is coupled structures where you have a capital entity like an AG or a GmbH, and then you have a company, a holding structure like an association, a foundation, or a cooperative or something like that. And so you have these kind of structures that are just a bit more complex, right? Even when you add the veto share to it to make sure it cannot be changed in the long run. So this makes it not easy. And I think that's where now our colleagues in the north are a bit further, and the same actually in the Netherlands. They went through parliament already, and they're currently working on a specific draft for a legal form. So maybe at some point we're at that stage in Switzerland too. We'll see. But I think we need some good examples first, and a good base and a broad base of companies that supports this. And for me, that's where it's very important to show that this is a neutral thing. That's why I'm like very picky there, mentioning that difference to social entrepreneurship and so on.
Right. So it's not about what you do, it's about how your company is structured.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Lukas, why should companies work with purpose, Switzerland?
Well, as that could be a very one simple reason, because we're one of the few, if not the only organization in Switzerland at the moment that can support you in becoming steward-owned. And so that's one very specific reason, but maybe you're also simply in a position where you start to think about ownership structures or your ownership structure of your company, and you want to get a view on things and have an exchange.
And if a company is interested, they can just reach out to you and say, hey, we're looking into founding a steward-owned company or turning our company into a steward-owned business.
Absolutely. What always helps is to look at one of the many materials that one can find online already on steward-ownership, because sometimes people heard of it, but have not really looked at specific cases or materials that are available. Podcasts like we're doing right now here, but there is videos from people on stage, there's case studies, there's books, magazines, there's many things that you can dive into this topic, and then what usually happens is questions come up, and that's the role that we very happily take. And you can very simply book an appointment with me actually on our website, and so that's a very good first entry point.
Cool. Thank you. So I also want to build a bridge here to the inclusive supply chains. So how is steward ownership or purpose connecting to inclusive sourcing strategies?
I think similar to a question of how can a steward-owned company be kind of impactful or pursue its goal or purpose. Steward ownership is kind of the underlying enabling structure that allows you to do so. Because what my view on things is that often you are maybe not inclusive or not fair in the way you source because you have some kind of economical pressure. Like you need to buy cheap or fast or whatever, and you cannot afford to be inclusive and fair and all of these things. And that's often coming out of short-term pressure, economic pressure that companies have. What I see and what I believe in very strongly is that if you're steward-owned, it gives the company itself a much longer perspective in acting. And once you allow a company to have that perspective, actually, it comes often quite naturally to the company to act in a more sustainable long-term fashion. And to give you a very practical example, a startup here in Zurich that did the transformation to steward-ownership, and they at the same time did a funding round. When they talked to investors, they were told the return expectations of these investors. It became clear to them that if they were to ever able to achieve these returns, they would have to change their business model. And they would have to squeeze out more out of their suppliers, and or they would have to ask higher prices from their customers. But doing either of those would actually have led to them going out of business because they lost their positioning in the market. Like they very much positioned themselves as a fair supplier and so on. And so they realized very quickly that, hey, if we want to find investors, we need some that are aligned on a value base with us, and they cannot have that mindset of these very high returns. So for them, it was kind of a natural fit in the end to like steward-ownership acted as the perfect filter for their investors because it filtered out all of them who had a more extractive mindset to be a bit extreme, but just needed higher returns from it. And so I think that's a very, very simple example, like that the ownership structure that you have and the connected incentives and mechanisms in there do have a very strong impact on the way you do business. And Ines Schiller from the company Wild in Berlin said this beautiful quote: we cannot have a regenerative business model if we have an extractive ownership structure. So that's, I think, how these two topics come together, right?
Very impressive. And I think the story with the startup just shows the values that you bring into a company and then decide, okay, no, we're not going to go with this investor because it doesn't align with our values and where we want to go and how we want to run our company. So it's also very brave to actually turn down the investment because of that reason.
Absolutely. And that's often a question or discussion that we have with founders, that basically they're very motivated to get their thing out there, right? And they just need some capital now. And there it's not always easy to take that step and say no to some sources of capital. And maybe one thing to add is also, which is important to me, is that I said it's a fruitful ground for that kind of sourcing, but it can still be that a company that is steward-owned doesn't act at all like that, right? It can still be that they maximize out of their value chain and, I don't know, don't source sustainably, whatever. Right.
Right. Interesting. And I think you can probably share some more stories and thoughts and information about purpose. But what I'm also interested in is there like an event or something coming up where people can connect with you, maybe just on a very easy level and then just have a chat?
Well, actually, we just did a roadshow through Switzerland. So in March and April, we went within 6 weeks to 6 cities and did plenty of different workshop formats and events. We're actually looking to do this probably again next year. And so that's definitely a chance, but we're regularly organizing smaller happenings and events with partners. So the easiest thing to notice that is either to just sign up on our newsletter, and we're going to have a little summer party on 3rd of July. And we have a beautiful rooftop here in the middle of the city in Zurich on Bahnhof Edikon, and that could be a very good option to simply drop by, meet in a more informal situation, and also meet many others who either have already had their experiences with this or are interested in it. And so I'm happily inviting all of your listeners to drop by. Simply sign up, go to our website on purpose-schweiz.org, and there under the events section you can sign up for the Summerfest.
I'll put the links into the information section of the podcast. Also, to sign up to your newsletter. I think that's a great source of information on being kept up to date, what's going on in your regards.
And we actually do every month a webinar. It's free for 45 minutes. We give you an introduction to student ownership. Always on the first Thursday of the month as well. You find that on our website. So that can also be a way to get your first introduction to the topic.
Yeah, I think that's probably also a great source for people who are interested to get some insights and learn some more about
Absolutely.
steward ownership and purpose.
Yes.
Switzerland. Awesome. So since we're at the end of this podcast, what is your takeaway from this session?
Well, my takeaway is that it's always interesting to have these conversations and have the different views. And now it was more the sourcing context. So that's also for me always interesting to dive into touch points on different aspects. So that's always cool. And if it's about giving some kind of food for thought for the listeners out there, I would definitely argue to start to be conscious about ownership structures. It's something that we can be much more conscious in designing this. And a second thing, for me, there's also an underlying view on humanity and on people in this context, particularly because if the company owns itself and you have stewards that take care of the company, that assumes a certain view on humanity and what human nature is, right? Are you that homo economicus that maximizes for your individual maximum profit, or are you actually more of a social being that is out for the benefit of our society? And I think that's very much the underlying view on humans that is behind this kind of ownership structure, that we are not all individually just maximizing for our profits, but we are kind of good people, again, good at heart. And if we put the right incentives there, we are also acting in a good way for society and for our planet. And to foster that, and if you want to dive deeper, there's a super interesting book by Rutger Bregman that I always recommend. It's called Humankind. It might change your view on humans.
Lukas loved those last words. I mean, it's steward ownership is not about being social, or it's not a social enterprise. It's making sure that money is staying in the hands of the company. Thank you so much for sharing all your information and insights and the stories that you experienced, and for being my guest today.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It was a pleasure, and anytime again.
Now, if you want to make your supply chain more inclusive, reach out via fipsconsulting.com or Fips Consulting on LinkedIn. Listen to my next episodes where I talk to more experts about inclusive sourcing, responsible sourcing, and the impact it has on the company. Reach out if you have any inputs or topics around inclusive sourcing or responsible sourcing you want me to talk about. Thanks much for listening, and bye, responsible.